The world stood frozen in fear. From the 1960s to the 1980s, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in a deadly race to build the most powerful nuclear weapons ever created. Each side watched the other with suspicion, believing that at any moment, a surprise strike could begin a war that would end life on Earth. Missiles sat armed and ready, hidden in silos, submarines, and secret bases across the globe. Governments spoke of peace, but behind closed doors, generals planned for the unthinkable. The policy known as mutually assured destruction meant that if one side launched an attack, the other would respond with equal or greater force. No one could win, yet both prepared to fight. Inside dark offices and hidden rooms, intelligence agencies worked without rest, listening, decoding, and spying, desperately trying to predict the enemy's next move. The fate of the planet depended on information, and one wrong judgment could bring everything to an end. Deep inside the heart of the Soviet Union, a man lived two lives. By day, he was a respected intelligence officer, trusted with the nation's most guarded secrets. He held access to top-secret missile plans, the kind of information that could decide who lived and who died if war ever broke out. But beneath the surface, something troubled him. He saw the truth of the Soviet system, the growing danger, the reckless push toward nuclear confrontation, and it terrified him. He realized that the world was standing on the edge of destruction, and those in power seemed blind to it. In that moment, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would risk everything: his rank, his safety, even his family, to prevent a war that could wipe out humanity. In the silence of his mind, the soldier became something else: a spy, a man willing to betray his government, not for money or fame, but for the hope of peace. In Moscow, the air itself felt heavy with suspicion. The city was a place where loyalty was measured by silence, and fear lived in every shadow. The KGB's eyes were everywhere: on the streets, in offices, even among friends. No one could be trusted, not even family. For Oleg Penkovsky, each day was a careful performance, a balancing act between duty and deception. Every glance over his shoulder reminded him that one wrong move would mean a bullet or a prison cell deep beneath Moscow. Still, he knew he had to act. Through small, cautious steps, Penkovsky began to build a bridge to the West. It started with whispers, subtle inquiries, and coded gestures, until one day, contact was made with the British intelligence service, MI6, and later the CIA. From that moment on, his life became a dangerous game of cat and mouse. He carried a small camera, no bigger than a matchbox, hidden in everyday objects. With it, he photographed pages of Soviet missile blueprints, weapons plans, and classified report secrets that could decide the future of nations. Each roll of film he passed along was worth more than gold, containing the truth that the Soviet Union's nuclear strength was far weaker than it pretended to be. Meetings were arranged with the precision of a spy novel. A newspaper folded in a certain way meant it was safe to approach. A matchbox placed on a park bench signaled a message had been delivered. Sometimes, exchanges happened in the quiet corners of crowded theaters, where the noise of the audience covered their whispers. Other times, it was in the narrow streets of Moscow at night, where shadows were their only allies. Every mission carried the weight of death. The KGB had ears in every building and informants in every crowd. Even the smallest sign of betrayal could bring soldiers crashing through his door before dawn. Still, Penkovsky continued, knowing that what he was doing could save millions of lives. He moved through each day as if walking on thin ice, smiling in meetings, saluting superiors, and pretending to be loyal, all while secretly dismantling the path to nuclear war. Each secret passed, each photo developed, and each coded message sent brought the world a step closer to safety. He wasn't just sending information. He was sending hope. Hope that reason could win over destruction. Hope that one man, working alone in the darkness, could hold back the fire that threatened to consume the entire world. The stream of information coming from Penkovsky was unlike anything Western intelligence had ever seen. Each photograph, each note, each coded film roll peeled back the curtain on the Soviet Union's greatest secret: its real nuclear strength. What he revealed stunned both the CIA and MI6. The Soviet military had long claimed to possess an unstoppable arsenal. Thousands of long-range missiles capable of striking the United States in minutes. They projected the image of a superpower standing equal, perhaps even superior to the West. But the truth buried in Penkovsky's intelligence was the exact opposite. The USSR had far fewer operational missiles than it boasted, and many of them were unreliable, plagued by technical flaws and limited range. Its nuclear shield was more illusion than power. Through sleepless nights and coded deliveries, Penkovsky sent film after film to his Western handlers, showing diagrams, launch site layouts, and missile specifications. His work painted a complete picture of the Soviet arsenal, something the world's most powerful spy satellites had failed to do. Analysts in Washington and London couldn't believe how deep his knowledge went. He knew where the missiles were kept, how quickly they could be launched, and even the weaknesses in Soviet radar systems. It was as if the entire Soviet defense network had been laid open on their desks. Then, in 1962, his information became the difference between war and survival. American U-2 spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. The discovery sent shockwaves through Washington. Military generals urged President Kennedy to strike immediately before the missiles became operational. The Pentagon prepared bombing plans, invasion routes, and nuclear response strategies. The world held its breath as both superpowers moved closer to the point of no return. But inside the White House, a secret briefing changed everything. Penkovsky's intelligence was brought to Kennedy and his advisors. The data proved that the Soviet Union's nuclear capabilities were not as fearsome as its threats suggested. Their intercontinental missiles were few, and many lacked the range to hit American cities. Even the missiles in Cuba, though dangerous, did not give Moscow the overwhelming power it claimed. This knowledge gave Kennedy something that every leader in crisis needs: time. Time to think, time to negotiate, and time to stop the unthinkable. Armed with that understanding, Kennedy chose a course of action no one expected. Instead of launching a devastating attack, he ordered a naval blockade around Cuba, effectively isolating the island without firing a single shot. His calm, measured approach confused Soviet leaders and shocked his own military advisors. But it worked. The pressure began to build on the Soviet side, and after days of tense communication, Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles. The crisis ended without a single weapon being fired. The world would never know how close it had come to destruction. Behind the scenes, one man's courage had made all the difference. While politicians took the credit and the newspapers declared victory, the real hero remained hidden in the shadows. Penkovsky's secret reports had given the United States an advantage that no weapon could match the truth. Because of that truth, the planet survived what could have been its final war. As the world exhaled in relief, Penkovsky's role remained locked away in classified files. His name whispered only in the halls of intelligence agencies. Few realized that in the tense chess game between East and West, a single spy had tipped the balance toward peace. His stolen documents, carried across borders and hidden in plain sight, had done more to protect humanity than any army could. And though he would never live to see the peace his actions helped preserve, his legacy was already written in history, the quiet triumph of courage over fear and truth over destruction. The story of Oleg Penkovsky did not end with his great act of courage. As the years went on, the danger around him grew heavier with each passing day. The KGB had begun to sense that something was wrong. Secret reports were missing from classified archives. Military information had somehow reached the West, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate through the Soviet intelligence community. Every officer was watched, every phone was tapped, and every shadow seemed to have ears. Penkovsky, once confident in his ability to hide his double life, began to feel the weight of constant fear pressing down on him. The walls of Moscow seemed to close in, and he knew it was only a matter of time before his luck ran out. He tried to act as he always did, calm, loyal, and professional, but the strain was visible. He looked over his shoulder more often. His friends began to avoid him, sensing danger. Rumors reached him that the KGB had formed a special team to find the source of the leaks that had humiliated the Soviet military. Somewhere deep down, Penkovsky must have known that the game was almost over. Yet he continued to deliver information, even as the risks became unbearable. Perhaps he believed that if he could pass just one more piece of intelligence, it might still help preserve peace. Then, one evening in 1963, the inevitable happened. A team of KGB officers surrounded his apartment building. Their knock on the door was not a request, but a command. Penkovsky was taken without resistance, his briefcase confiscated, his home searched from top to bottom. Files were torn apart, furniture smashed, every secret hiding place uncovered. Neighbors peeked through their doors in silence, pretending not to see. Within hours, Penkovsky was locked away inside Lubyanka prison, the most feared place in all of Moscow. In that fortress of despair, interrogations went on for days and nights without end. The KGB demanded names, methods, and every detail of his contact with the West. The bright lights, the shouting voices, the endless questions, all meant to break his will. But Penkovsky stayed silent on the names of those who helped him. He took the full weight of his actions upon himself, refusing to expose anyone else. Even when offered false promises of mercy, he said nothing. He had already accepted his fate. When his trial began, it was little more than a performance for the cameras. Soviet officials wanted an example, a warning to others who might dare to question the state. Penkovsky stood accused of treason, espionage, and betrayal of the motherland. The evidence was overwhelming: photos, microfilm testimonies from those who had unknowingly crossed his path. There was no lawyer who could save him, no appeal that could reach sympathetic ears. His guilt had been decided long before the trial began. Through it all, he remained calm. Witnesses later described him as composed, even dignified. He knew he had done what he believed was right. When the sentence was read, he neither pleaded nor protested. Perhaps, in that moment, he thought not of himself, but of the millions who might never know how close they had come to annihilation, and how one man had bought them time to live in peace. After the verdict, he vanished from the public eye. Some said he was shot by firing squad. Others whispered he met a darker end, burned alive in secret as a message to any who would dare follow in his footsteps. The truth was buried, hidden beneath layers of Soviet secrecy. His family was silenced, his records erased. To the world, Oleg Penkovsky no longer existed. In the West, the agencies that had relied on him could do nothing but grieve in silence. They could not acknowledge his name or his sacrifice. There were no public honors, no recognition, only quiet respect in the corridors of intelligence offices. Behind closed doors, those who had known him raised a glass to his memory. Knowing that the information he had risked everything to share had prevented a war that would have ended millions of lives, decades passed before his name resurfaced, whispered by historians and declassified documents. Yet, even now, much about him remains a mystery. He died alone, branded a traitor by his homeland, but remembered by those who understood his mission as something far greater. He had not betrayed his country for wealth or fame. He had done it for humanity itself. His story became a symbol of what it means to choose truth over fear, to sacrifice everything for the greater good. Though the world never saw his face on a statue or his name carved into marble, his legacy survived in every generation that lived free from nuclear fire. His final act was not one of despair, but of faith. The faith that one man's courage could make a difference, even in the darkest times. In the end, Oleg Penkovsky's greatest achievement was not in what he destroyed, but in what he preserved, the fragile piece of a world that had almost burned. When the dust settled after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world did not immediately realize just how close it had come to annihilation. The newspapers of 1962 told of tense days and midnight phone calls between Washington and Moscow. But what few understood was that the true battle had not been fought in the skies or on the seas, it had been fought in the shadows, with intelligence and courage. The crisis had shown the limits of power. Despite all their armies and weapons, both superpowers were suddenly aware of their own fragility. One false move, one miscalculation, could have brought the end of civilization itself. And in that fragile balance between war and peace, the information Oleg Penkovsky had provided made all the difference. Behind the scenes, the intelligence he had passed was poured over by analysts, generals, and world leaders. The data showed exactly what kind of missiles the Soviets possessed, their range, their readiness, and their weaknesses. It removed the fog of fear that often drives nations to war. For the first time, the United States could see the enemy not as an unstoppable force, but as a rival that could be understood and contained. That understanding became the foundation of the cautious diplomacy that followed. Instead of attacking, the U.S. chose to negotiate, knowing that the Soviets were bluffing strength they did not yet have. In Moscow, however, the crisis had the opposite effect. The humiliation of being forced to remove missiles from Cuba struck deep into Soviet pride. Their leaders began to realize that secrecy and deception could no longer guarantee security. They too saw that nuclear war was not a victory, but a suicide pact. Quietly, even within the halls of the Kremlin, the lessons of the crisis began to reshape thinking. There were no speeches, no public confessions, but the reality was, no one could win a nuclear war. Over the next few years, the Cold War entered a new phase. The threat never vanished, but it became tempered by reason. The hotlines between Moscow and Washington were established, ensuring that leaders could speak directly before acting. Arms control talks began, leading to agreements like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and later the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. The very concept of dialogue, once unthinkable, was born out of the terror both sides had felt during those 13 days in 1962. Unseen and unacknowledged, Penkovsky's influence stretched far beyond his lifetime. The intelligence community continued to use his insights to interpret Soviet behavior. His reports became part of the training material for analysts and operatives, a reminder of what human courage could achieve when technology and politics reached their limits. Those who studied his case spoke of him with quiet respect. They understood that every piece of intelligence he smuggled out had been bought with the risk of his life. His work had not only informed decisions during the crisis, but it shaped the entire strategy of how to deal with the Soviet Union afterward. Meanwhile, the world outside continued on, oblivious. Children played in parks, families built homes, and nations grew. They did not know that their normal lives were possible only because one man had stood in defiance of his own government. Even as he was erased from Soviet records, his influence lived on in every peaceful year that followed. The silence that covered his story was, in its own way, proof of success. No one ever heard the thunder of missiles he had helped prevent. In Western intelligence circles, Penkovsky's name became something whispered with reverence. Those who worked in the field studied his techniques, how he passed information, how he avoided detection, how he managed to outwit one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world. They knew that what he had done was not just espionage. It was an act of moral resistance. His work had not been motivated by politics or money, but by conscience. In a time when fear ruled nations, he had chosen truth over silence. Years later, as the Cold War began to fade and old secrets were declassified, historians started to uncover the full extent of his contribution. The documents confirmed what insiders had long suspected without Penkovsky's intelligence. The United States might have panicked into launching an attack, believing the Soviets were stronger than they really were. And if that had happened, the world as we know it could have ended in a matter of hours. By then, his name had begun to appear in books, documentaries, and declassified reports. People finally started to understand the weight of his actions. Yet even with the recognition, his story carried a quiet sadness. He never saw the peace he helped create. He never witnessed the easing of tensions, the handshake between superpowers, or the families who would live because of his bravery. His victory was one he could not share, a triumph built on sacrifice. And still, his legacy endured. Every treaty signed, every missile dismantled, every day the world remained free from nuclear war was, in part, his doing. The Cold War would continue for decades, but never again would it reach the brink of 1962. The lesson Penkovsky helped teach both sides that survival was more important than domination became the silent foundation of the peace that followed. It is a strange thing to think about, that the fate of millions rested not in the hands of presidents or generals, but in the quiet courage of one man who decided to act. History rarely remembers such people with the attention they deserve, but their impact lingers in every heartbeat of peace that follows. Oleg Penkovsky's actions proved that a single individual, armed with conviction and clarity, could change the course of human destiny. His sacrifice became a silent echo through Timma, reminder that even in the darkest struggles, humanity's hope often depends on the bravery of one. Today, Oleg Penkovsky's name is known only to those who look deeply into the hidden pages of history. To most people, he is just another forgotten figure from a distant era, lost amid the noise of the Cold War. Yet his actions ripple quietly through time, shaping a world that never realized how close it came to destruction. The peace that so many took for granted in the decades after 1962 was in many ways built on the courage of this one man who chose to act when it mattered most. When we think about heroes, we often imagine soldiers charging into battle, flags waving, or leaders giving stirring speeches that echo through the ages. But Penkovsky's war was different. He fought alone, without an army, without recognition, and without the hope of rescue. His battleground was the world of shadows, the narrow alleys of Moscow, the dim light of safe houses, the coded messages hidden in plain sight. Each secret he passed carried a piece of his soul. Each risk he took pushed him closer to his own end. And yet he never stopped. He knew the danger, he understood the cost, but he also knew the value of what he was protecting, the future of humanity itself. In a world dominated by propaganda and fear, Penkovsky made a choice few would ever dare. He decided that truth was worth more than blind loyalty. He looked beyond the flags, the slogans, and the threats, and saw a world hanging by a thread. His actions were not born of hatred for his homeland, but of love for mankind. He saw children, families, cities, all of them at risk of being wiped out in a single flash of light. He couldn't stand by and watch that happen, so he acted quietly, methodically, knowing that he might never live to see the results of his work. Decades later, the courage he showed still speaks to us. In every corner of the world, new forms of conflict emerge, not always with missiles or tanks, but with lies, manipulation, and fear. And once again, it is often the few who stand up for truth that keep humanity from falling apart. Penkovsky's life is a reminder that the power to shape history does not always belong to presidents or generals. Sometimes it belongs to the person who chooses integrity over safety, who dares to speak truth where silence is expected. His legacy is not carved in stone or celebrated with parades. It lives instead in the quiet moments of peace we experience every day, in the hum of cities that were never destroyed, in the laughter of children who never saw war, in the sunrise over a world that still exists because one man refused to let fear rule him. His impact may be invisible, but it is deeply real, woven into the very fabric of modern peace. Even within the intelligence community, where his name is still spoken with reverence, Penkovsky's story carries lessons that endure. He showed that information truth can be more powerful than weapons, that a single act of conscience can hold back the tides of destruction. He stood as proof that morality and courage can survive even in the darkest systems, even under the watchful eyes of tyranny. In a time when it was easier to obey, he chose to resist. In a world where survival meant silence, he chose to speak. His actions remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite it. That kind of bravery does not fade with time. It becomes a light, guiding future generations to stand for what is right, even when the world seems to be falling apart. Perhaps the most haunting part of his story is that he never knew how much difference he made. He died believing his work might have been forgotten, his sacrifice in vain. But in truth, his decision changed the course of the 20th century. The missiles that never launched, the war that never happened. The peace that followed all of it stands as silent proof that he did not die for nothing. Today, when we hear his story, we are reminded that peace is fragile, and that the world still depends on the courage of individuals who choose principle over power. Oleg Penkovsky will never be remembered by the masses, but for those who understand what he did, his name represents something eternal, the belief that truth, no matter how dangerous, is worth defending. He didn't fight with guns or bombs. He fought with truth, and sometimes the truth is what saves us all. The Cold War was a time when the world lived in constant fear, a silent tension that stretched across continents and crept into every home. It was an era of power, secrecy, and sacrifice, where the smallest actions could shift the fate of nations. And among all those untold stories, the story of Oleg Penkovsky stands as one of the most powerful and haunting. He was a man who gave everything he had, not for recognition, not for reward, but to keep the peace in a world that had forgotten how close it was to losing everything. Imagine standing in his place, surrounded by enemies on all sides, knowing that a single mistake could mean death. Would you still choose to do what's right? Would you still risk everything to protect the lives of people you would never meet? These are the questions his story leaves us with. Questions that echo through time and force us to think about what courage really means. The Cold War was not just a conflict of weapons, it was a battle of ideals, of fear and hope, of truth and deception. People like Penkovsky fought not with bullets, but with belief. Belief that one person's decision could make a difference, and he proved it could. His story reminds us that even in the darkest times, light can come from the unlikeliest of places. So now, as you think about his journey, Ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in his place? Would you stay silent, or would you take the risk for something greater than yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think about this incredible chapter of Cold War history. And if stories like this fascinate you, stories hidden behind iron walls, buried in secret archives, and written by the hands of unsung heroes, then make sure to subscribe to Cold War Files. There are countless more tales waiting to be uncovered. Stories that reveal how close we came to disaster and how human courage pulled us back from the edge. History hides its greatest truths in silence, but together we can bring them back to light. Stay curious, stay brave, and join us again for another journey through the hidden world of the Cold War.